Our next speaker, an ultimate speaker of these 2 days, is Matteo Stettler, a PhD candidate in philosophy at Deakin University, Australia. So great to have these two. That's I think the supervisor of Matthew. I think Matthew just delivered his PhD a few weeks. When did you do it?
Yeah, a month ago.
A month ago. So he's still alive. And he collaborates with research groups. Well, our research group here, Forms of Life and Practice of Philosophy is an art as a way of life, and also at the Pontificia Università Gregoriana of Rome, also philosophy is a way of life. He's co-authored with Matthew Sharp and some specialist articles for classical receptions and philosophy today, and his work has appeared in various different journals. You can find all these in the booklet. And his latest publication is called Thorough Stoicism in Letters to Various Persons, The Spiritual Direction of Harrison Blake, which so that's the second one. And then there's another one called, that's the whole title, is it? Okay.
Title and
title.
Yeah.
You can find all this in the booklet and read it yourself this evening. So the title of Matteo's talk today, as far as I know, is Intellectual Felicity in the Latin Averroists, Exploring the Limits of Hadot's Metaphilosophy in the Middle Ages. So the floor is yours.
All right. Right. Thank you, Bartholomew. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Marta and Hélder, for organizing this conference. As the only, PhD student in the group, I'm very humbled and happy to be here and given this chance to present what I hope would become the beginning of my postdoctoral research. So, intellectual philosophy in the Latin Averroists. So let's start from the beginning of the story. So in 2003, the Italian historian of medieval philosophy, Gianfranco Fioravanti, presented at the 13th Congress of the Italian Society for the Study of Medieval Thought a first record on the contemporary historiography on the notion of felicità intellettuale o mentale, intellectual or mental felicity, on the exact definition of which we shall linger soon enough in the course of my presentation. So on that occasion, Fioravanti noted with great perspicacity that the then raging discussion around this theme, the theme of intellectual philosophy among medievalists, had a more ancient history, he says, one that was tied to two figures that were foreign to the world of Italian society, namely Pierre Hadot and Julius Domesday, whom Fioravanti credits for having popularized among contemporary medievalists what Hadot had written in Exercices Spirituels concerning the ancient notion of philosophy as a way of life. Now, even though Hadot's explanation for the disappearance of this ancient conception of philosophy had involved the Middle Ages, as Fioravanti puts it, rather heavily, the Italian scholar notes that Hadot's volume did not receive much considerations by historians of medieval philosophy at the time of its first publication in 1981, with the only notable exception of a review by Ruedi-Imbach, published in 1983. Now, while Hadot's thesis did eventually come at the center of attention for some historians of medieval philosophy, especially in the German-speaking world, interestingly, one cannot shake the sense that the following discussion has not always been as satisfying and productive as it could have. Now, to our disappointment, many medievalists, such as the otherwise impeccable Fioravanti himself, have been often so busy criticizing Hadot's original thesis on the medieval decline of philosophy as a way of life that they have often overlooked the important revision to which Hadot had subjected this his thesis to after his so-called spiritual encounter with Domesday's work. On the other hand, it has so far gone almost completely unexplored what the post-1990s Hadot's acceptance of some interpretative positions currently debated by historians of medieval philosophy might itself mean for his own conceptualization of the ancient notion of philosophy as a way of life. So in the present revisitation of the historiography on the notion of intellectual philosophy, I thus hope to be able to accomplish...
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
The file is not shared on Zoom.
What's wrong?
The PowerPoint is not connected to the Zoom.
My apologies. Here. No, it's sure. That's 1 moment. There we go.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. My apologies.
Somebody's watching it, it's good.
That's
a good sign. That was our test.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hope for philosophy.
So as I was saying, in my presentation, what I set myself to accomplish are 2 things. First, I intend to provide a corrective to the faulty understanding that so many contemporary medievalists still seem to have of Hadot's contributions to study of medieval philosophy. On the other hand, I want to show how the current debates raging in medievalist circles might, on the other hand, point us towards some of the possible limitations with Hadot's own understanding of philosophy as a way of life. So let's proceed by sketching out what I think are the 2 dimensions of characterizing Hadot's work. So the 1981 collection of essays, Exercices spirituels et philosophie antique by Pierre Hadot, is almost universally credited for having inaugurated the modern scholarship on the notion of philosophy as a way of life. In the essay after which this collection gets its title, namely Exercices spirituels, Hadot endeavored not only to redefine the essence of ancient philosophy around the practice of spiritual exercises, but also try to sketch the historical conditions that brought to the eventual disappearance of this conception of philosophy from the horizons of Western culture. So as Hadot himself tells us, it is precisely by these 2 themes, one that we might regard as metaphilosophical and the other that we might consider as properly historical, that Foucault's interest in Hadot's work was initially sparked. And in some sense, the fortune of Hadot's career was also made outside classicist circles. So these 2 guiding themes of Hadot's article, the metaphilosophical and the historical, however, did not simply attract Foucault's interest, but eventually also other philosophers' criticism. In his 1983 review of Hadot's collection, mentioned by Fioravanti, Reddy Imbach challenged both dimensions of Hadot's study, the metaphilosophical and the historical. So concerning the first metaphilosophical dimension, Imbach himself notes that, quote, Hadot's studies encourage us to perceive the unity of ancient philosophy in a conversion ever renewed by a spiritual practice. So on this point, the Swiss scholar points towards an exception, namely that of Aristotle, of which we've talked today. He says, Imbach, the author, namely Hadot, includes Aristotle in his panorama of ancient philosophy. However, he questions, is it really a matter of spiritual exercises with Aristotle? Is it not precisely Aristotle who is the father of a purely theoretical conception which aims at knowledge for the sake of knowledge? Moreover, Imbach continues, even if we conceded Hadot that from a metaphilosophical point of view, also Aristotle's philosophy essentially consisted in a way of life, this would not exclude that from a historical point of view, that is precisely not how Aristotle's works have been received by medieval Christians. In any case, Imbach tells us, its historical impact confirms a purely theoretical apprehension of Aristotelian thought. Now, this, according to Imbach, introduces a second-order challenge to Hadot's original narrative of the decline of spirituality. Quote, the author tries to provide an answer to the question for what reason and when did philosophy begin to become an exclusively theoretical approach. In my opinion, Imbach writes, the idea according to which this paradigm shift occurred in the Middle Ages is correct, but the role of servant of philosophy is not responsible for it. In my opinion, it is rather the reception of Aristotle's in the 13th century that is to blame, end quote. As we shall see more in depth in the course of this presentation, Hadot's rejoinder to Imbach's preoccupations was not really long to come, as Hadot will eventually address Imbach's preoccupations at some length in the postface to the second 1987 edition of Exercice Spirituel, at a time in which Hadot's encounter with Domansky's research was already beginning to bear its fruits. Let's move to the first dimension, the first axis, the metaphilosophical question. So in the postface to the second edition of Exercice, as a rejoinder to Imbach's challenge to the metaphilosophical dimension of his study, Hadot claimed that if indeed Aristotle's philosophy was a philosophy of theoria, we should nonetheless abstain from conceiving such theoria in modern terms as purely theoretic. Because, he argues, the Stagirite conceived of such theoria as in itself a practice and a mode of living. We all know Hadot's claims. Now, the figure of Aristotle is particularly important for Hadot's account of ancient philosophy. For, as he himself tells us in Ancient Philosophy and Ethics or Practice, this wonderful little essay, it is in fact precisely the borderline and seemingly problematic case of Aristotle that allows us to best capture what ancient spirituality was all about, at least according to Hadot, of course. Hadot will eventually expand on the same topic in a section of what is ancient philosophy dedicated to the so-called theoretical form of life, taking care to distinguish this time the theoretical form of life from the more mundane and certainly less ambitious life of the scholar. So according to Hadot, in fact, quote, it would be difficult to say that the activities of a scholar include the activity of the mind, which according to Aristotle is analogous and certainly in certain privileged moments to the activity of that first principle, which is the thought of thought. So unlike the life of the scholar, the theoretical form of life that was espoused by Aristotle and the members of his Lyceum, according to Hadot, included that universalist or transcendent dimension that perhaps represents one of the most distinctive features of Hadot's reconstruction of ancient philosophy, especially when this reconstruction is just opposed to Foucault's, for example. As Hadot argues, quote, this form of life represents the highest form of human happiness, yet it can also be said that such happiness is superhuman. This paradox corresponds to Aristotle's paradoxical and enigmatic view of the mind and intellect. The intellect is what is most essential in man, yet at the same time it is something divine which enters into him. So what transcends man constitutes is true personality. It is as if, Hadot concludes, man's true essence consisted in being above himself. As in Plato, then, philosophical choice leads the individual self to go beyond its limits to a superior self and to raise itself up to a universal point of view, end quote. Even though, of course, even Hadot has to admit that for Aristotle, such a process of universalization or divinization of the self cannot be but temporary or fleeting. For instance, he says, when Aristotle wants to make us understand the mode of life of thought, the first principle upon which the world of the stars and the sublunary nature depend, he declares, quoting the metaphysics, this way of life is comparable to what for us is the best way of life, which we can live only for a short period of time. The summit of philosophical happiness and of the activity of the mind, then Hadot concludes, that is, the contemplation of the divine intellect, is accessible to man only in rare moments, end quote. So however rare and temporary, according to Hadot, it is exactly this universal or transcendent experience of the human intellect that seems to set apart the theoretic or theorique preoccupations of a mere scholar and the theoretical, theoretic vocation of an ancient philosopher like Aristotle. For, as Hadot eloquently puts it, nothing is farther from theory than the theoretical or contemplation. Now let's move rapidly to the historical question. So as Gianfranco Fioravanti pointed out, the concept of intellectual felicity as a form of life had not yet made headway in the 1983 review of Hadot's Exercices Spirituels by Imbach. However, this concept also was not long to come, as it was exactly during the same year that the Italian scholar Maria Curti eventually published her pioneering La felicità mentale, nuove prospettive per cavalcanti e tante, thus inaugurating another interpretative model whereby Hadot's thesis on the medieval decline of the ancient conception of philosophy as a way of life could be challenged, in addition to Imbach's model. So Maria Curti's idea of intellectual felicity, felicità mentale in Italian, as Dragos Calma concisely puts it, quote, is used to summarize the scholastic appropriation of Averroists' interpretation of Aristotle's account in the Nicomachean Ethics concerning philosophy as the supreme good and source of happiness. According to some key figures of the 13th and 14th centuries, such as Boethius of Dacia and Sigurd of Brabant, philosophy was an autonomous discipline with its own set of rules, methods, and objects of knowledge. And the study of philosophy represented the highest form of life. Some scholars, concludes Calma, call this radical view ethical Averroism. Now, when talking of an ethical Averroism, Calma is here explicitly referring So when talking of an ethical Averroism, Calma is here explicitly referring to the works of a French scholar, Alain de Libérat, especially Pensée en Moyen Âge, whose interpretative proposal, namely the identification of the spirit or essence of medieval philosophy with his Parisian masters, is best understood by contrast to Hadot's own proposal. As Alain de Libérat himself tells us in an interview, he says, quote, my point is better understood, I think, if we compare it to the thesis of Pierre Hadot, according to whom medieval scholasticism organized the divorce between theory and practice, philosophy and spirituality, choice of life and abstract knowledge. Speaking of the spirit of medieval philosophy, which, according to Libérat, is identified with this Parisian masters, I wanted to emphasize that philosophy as a form of life, on the contrary, had not disappeared in the Middle Ages, that it had only changed its institutional location, the university, and no longer the academy, the lyceum, or the porch. Now, from this point of view, Fioravanti is thus entirely on point when he remarked in his historiographical review that, quote, in a certain sense, the cipher of the mental felicity introduced by Maria Curti worked as a catalyst of interpretations and trends, the outcome of which could present itself as a response to Hadot's thesis. Right at the beginning of its structuring as a public and university discipline, philosophy presents itself in the Middle Ages as a form of life, even as the highest form of life, thus consciously linking itself to the tradition of the classical world. Now, while Hadot never quite interacted with Curti's work, nor systematically engaged with any of the scholars that were influenced by Maria Curti's account, such as Alain de Libérat himself, Hadot appears to have eventually reached the same insights by the works of the Polish scholar Julius Domanski. So in many places in his writings, Hadot explains how, after his spiritual encounter with a Polish scholar in the late 70s, he was prompted to qualify the picture of the decline of the ancient conception of philosophy as a way of life in the Middle Ages that he had painted early on in the first edition of his book. So according to Hadot, it is the, quote, immense merit of Domansky's La Philosophie to have isolated the existence and rehabilitated the significance of what he considers as being an important counter-tendency to 13th century scholasticism, namely that of Latin Averroists, in fact, like Sigurd Brabant, Poetische of Beira, who, according to Domansky, assured to philosophy its autonomy from Christian theology, abstaining from considering philosophy as a mere propedeutic to Christian theology. So particularly relevant for Hadot is the case of Boethius of Dacia, who in his De Summo Bono, on the supreme good, we are told that rediscovers the, quote, ideal of the contemplative life professed by Aristotle in the last pages of the Nicomachean Ethics. A thesis that Hadot will appropriate and use in the postface to the 1987 edition of Exercice Spirituel as a response to Imbach's critique. There, Hadot writes, Imbach also asks me if the reason why philosophy became purely theoretic in the Middle Ages might not be the reception of Aristotle in the 13th century. In a sense, the reception of Aristotle in the 13th century, Hadot tells us, rather gave a boost to the ideal of the philosophical life independent of theology. So Hadot's eventual change of mind is the reason why scholars such as John Ertzen and other scholars in medieval philosophy of the early 2000s consider Hadot to be part of that so-called new tendency in the study of medieval philosophy, that tendency that sees in the faculty of the arts the essence or the spirit of medieval philosophy, a tendency of which Alain de Libera can be considered the main representative. And that's also the reason why these scholars could systematically connect the interpretative proposal of Alain de Libera and Pierre Hadot in their reconstructions of medieval philosophy. As I shall now make the case, there might be more than their common focus on the magistry of the Parisian University to unite Alain de Libera's understanding of the phenomenon of intellectual felicity, and on the other side, Hadot's account of the rediscovery of the notion of philosophy as a way of life in the Middle Ages. In what is ancient philosophy, Hadot tells us, quote, throughout the history of Western philosophy, we note a certain permanence and survival of the ancient notion. From the Middle Ages to today, some philosophers have remained faithful to a vital existential dimension of ancient philosophy. At times, he tells us importantly, they have been active in the very heart of the university, such as is the case of the Latin Averroists, in fact. But more often, importantly, he tells us they were reacting against it. Sometimes they acted alone, but generally they did so from bases which were foreign to the university, such as certain religious and secular communities. Thanks to translations of Aristotle's made from Greek and Arabic, professors in the Faculty of the Arts saw that the essential point of philosophy for the philosopher was precisely to devote oneself to a life of research, life of contemplation, and, importantly, Hadot tells us, above all, an effort to assimilate oneself to the divine intellect. We find, he concludes, the same attitude in like authors in like Dante and Meister Eckhart. So while declaredly influenced by Domansky's account, Hadot's understanding of this complex historical juncture seems to carry also the distinctive marks of the narrative developed by Alain de Libera in Pensée au Moyen Âge, to which, in fact, Hadot readdresses the reader in footnote of this quotation. I think that two are the main ideas that Hadot seems to have drawn from de Libera. First, the idea that the significance of the rediscovery of the idea of philosophy as a way of life by these professional philosophers is only later overshadowed by the significance of the so-called deprofessionalization of such notion of philosophy and its development outside the walls of this medieval institution. In other terms, Hadot seems to have subscribed to the idea that it will be in the works of light authors such as precisely Dante's Convivio that the ideal of intellectual felicity that was only briefly and imperfectly sketched by the Magistri will reach its fullest and finest expression. These are in fact some of the most recognizable contributions made by Alain de Libera in Pensée au Moyen Âge. Moreover, and more critically, also here, as in Aristotle's case, what in Hadot's eyes prevents the Latin Averroists from being declassified to the rank of mere scholars, and at the same time grants them the title of heirs of the ancient conception of philosophy as a way of life, it's not so much their commitment to theoretical activities as the universalist and transcendent aspirations that seemingly animated their life projects, namely the attempt to reach a state of union or assimilation with a divine intelligence. Now, while Hadot's formula per se does not seem to automatically assume any specific doctrinal commitment on the part of these magistri, Hadot's close dependence on Pensée au Moyen Âge in this specific passage of what is ancient philosophy cannot help but raise the suspicion that alongside the notion of a deprofessionalization of philosophy, Hadot might have here stumbled upon and found confirmation of his own conceptualization of philosophy as a way of life in one of the most controversial and debated aspects of Alain de Libera's works on the subject, namely the identity that the French medievalist assumes between the notion of intellectual felicity and, on the other side, the doctrine of the conjunction or the copulatio or coniunto with the agent intellect, from which in the discourse, in the psychological discourse, the knowledge of the separated substances is said to derive, which is, as we shall see now, a rather critical point. Now let's talk about the so-called fabula or fabrication of the assimilation to the divine intellect. So in 1990, Alain de Libera had concluded his study Albert le Grand et la Philosophie by confirming the Italian Bruno Nardi's thesis concerning the influence that Albert the Great had exercised on some of the central tenets of the so-called Latin Averroists. According to Alain de Libera, the theory of intellectual felicity that Albert had developed on the basis of Arabic sources, especially Al-Farabi, was eventually taken up by, quote, the majority of those who, since Renan, has been called Averroists, all of which, he says, profess, quote, the Albertist doctrine of philosophical contemplation, purely intellectual metaphysical knowledge, realizing in this life a union of man with God and with the separate substances, thanks to study and the exercise of God. End quote. So in other terms, as Alain de Libera synthetically puts it, quote, the doctrine of mental felicity is the theoretical justification of a living practice of philosophy pioneered by Albert the Great and his epigones, namely the Latin Averroists. Its originality is to be a philosophical humanism rooted in a unitive experience of the transcendent, which remains properly philosophical, end quote. Now, this issue concerning the assimilation to the divine intellect might seem at first a rather abstract and purely scholastic matter of discussion, but actually, as Carlos Steele tells us, it is a question about the, quote, the very possibility of the vita philosophy, of the life of the philosopher, and its own ambitions, and those ambitions are great. So among other things, de Libera's reading was attractive because it provided a good explanation for the antagonistic relationship that was established between philosophy and Christian theology in the 13th and 14th centuries, and thus for explaining the condemnations of the year 1277 by the Bishop Tempier. At the time, according to the Libera, we were presented with, quote, not a representation or a dead concept in philosophy opposed to a living practice of theology and theological faith, but two practices, two constituted and directive ideals of life, end quote. The Latin Averroists represented a threat to the Bishop Tempier, who then condemned them, so this reasoning goes, because they propose a conception of philosophy tied to the contemplation of the divine that was bound to worry the theologians of the time, who would see in it, quote, an unfair competition, the formidable affirmation of another way, a philosophical and why not live way towards asceticism, end quote. So while eventually agreeing with Alain de Libera on the centrality of this ethical issue for the condemnations of the year 1277, other scholars strongly questioned the solidity of the ties that Alain de Libera and also seemingly Hadot had assumed to connect the ideal of the philosophical life that was proposed by these professional philosophers to the Averroist doctrine of the copulatio or the coniuncto with the aged intellect. So as Ebbison tells us, because of the condemnation of the year 1277, scholarship has had a tendency to focus on claims to the effect that the ultimate reward for good study is some sort of union with an impersonal super-intellect. It would be foolish to deny that such a claim occurred, but I think the attention paid to this particular piece of doctrine tends to make us blind to the bigger picture. Some arts masters believe in a union with a superior intellect, some do not. And those who did believe in it did not at all believe in the same sort of union, or for that matter, in the same sort of super intellect, but they all believed in the salutary effects of knowledge. Now, taking a similar stance against Alain de Libera, also the Italian scholar Luca Bianchi more recently concluded that, quote, there were a multiplicity of ways of understanding the theme of intellectual felicity, that this theme is not, to use Fioravanti's words, inextricably linked to the doctrine or the fabrication of the copulatio with the separate intelligences. And finally, that behind the insistent and sometimes repetitious exaltation of philosophy as a perfect form of life, there were hidden different ideas, theoretical concerns, and sensitivities, end quote. So, as Fioravanti tells us, no continuatio, no copulatio, no holy or adeptus intellect appears in these lines, as he concludes by studying the texts of these masters, such as Sigurd of Brabant, Boetius of Dacia, and even the Bolognese Averroist Giacomo da Pistoia. The exercise of the intellect that Eve lists in all of these authors seems to be identified in a strictly Aristotelian manner with the possession of the three branches of theoretical knowledge. So physics, mathematics, and the top metaphysics. This, as Faustino, another important Italian scholar, has recently shown, would seem to apply also to Dante, whose thesis is perfectly homogeneous to that of the Magistri on this point, according to him. Now, very briefly, some conclusions. So, the revisitation of the historiography and the theme of intellectual felicity undertaken so far, I think, suggests two interpretative possibilities. So either Fioravanti and Bianchi are right, and the paradigm of an intellectual felicity, namely a medieval rediscovery of philosophy and the way of life, are not inextricably tied to a unitive experience with the transcendent, to a process of assimilation to a divine intellect, as Hadot had assumed most probably in the wake of Alain de Libera's work. Or, if we stick to the conceptual standards that both de Libera and Hadot has set and insist on assuming the existence of such a connection, we are going to have to dramatically restrict the list of those medieval authors who predicated model of an intellectual felicity and thus rediscovered philosophy as a way of life. to those Averroists who fully adopted the doctrine of the coniuncto, in this way excluding from our accounts masters such as Sigurd of Brabant, Boetius of Asia, or Giacomo da Pistoia. So, of course, I won't be practically able to settle such a complex question here, as this would necessarily call for an attentive examination of the actual texts of these medieval authors, which is a task that lays well beyond the modest aims that I set myself to accomplish in this historiographical review. However, I think it is worth considering, at last, one of the strongest objections that scholars have raised so far to Hadot's and Alain de Libera's interpretative proposal. So according to Fioravanti, not only the paradigm of intellectual felicity and the assimilation with the divine intellect are not systematically associated across all the so-called Latin Averroists, but whenever they happen to be, as they do, this association actually casts doubts upon the credibility of the aspirations that these philosophers by professions claim to entertain, and raise the suspicion that no actual exercise or effort backed their ascetic life project. Now, the words, as already hinted above, the assimilation to the agent intellect, at which some, and only some, of these magistri purported to be aiming, might very well be nothing more than a fabrication, a fabula, built to promote the interest of their professional corporation, according to Fioravanti. As he tells us, quote, Plotinus's affirmation on the attainment of the one, or Augustine's experience in Ostia, may still arouse our interest, but a corporation of university professors who, as Pomponazzi will ironize, quotidie brandet cum Deo, every day dine with God, can only have an estranging effect on us and arouse the suspicion of the existence of an ideological propaganda behind which it is difficult, if not impossible, for us to identify any real practice. I would like to conclude my presentation by raising a final doubt by again borrowing the words of Fioravanti, which might be relevant for discussion. Fioravanti tells us, quote, the question remains open as to whether the concrete teaching activity of philosophy professors, including career, legal and economic relationships with colleagues and authorities, and also penal quarrels and disputes, could approach the model of the speculative life of the philosopher, of which these masters presented themselves as exponents and heralds. And that would be all for my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Matteo. Again, perfect timing. Actually, finished a bit earlier. We did excellent.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Definitely a lot of stars there. So, yeah, we have 15 minutes. So, Gianfranco, where the microphone is, and John, where's the microphone?
Thank you very much, Matteo, also for taking back to our debates with Franco Fioravanti. Really was a great master himself in Pisa some decades ago. And I can justify something about him and precisely what to say about his precisely his attention, his provoking us to reconnect study of medieval philosophy to a worldview that we can have as contemporary scholars. And I remember this thing that is quite interesting, for our approach. That is, we have to historically understand, approach how belief of also scholastic men or scholastic professors was alive. So it was a different life, but we have just to historically contextualize it, no? Which kind of life it was different from now. So I think that we can also approach or a critic eventually adopting this point of view, because just an historical study of philosophy or approach of philosophy
Might not be enough.
can really let us understand how another man can really live. So just the point of view, it was just a one about this. But I think that is important. I think about your consideration. Considering also the other studies of Fioravanti, I think that other authors, pre-scholastic and not poetic, no, but I think, for instance, to Averroists, no, and some also outside of Britain, as epistolary he had with the letter he wrote to Eloisa, is also they justify, no, another form of living and the difficulty that a philosopher as Averroists was also to couch life, no, through his thought. And also another question that is we can approach in order just to understand if some of medieval philosophers can inherit a form of life or can be included in a tradition, as we see, is also that just not happiness or the pursuit of or happiness could be considered a point of approach, but also the problem of on the malum. Averroists, for instance, wrote precisely an Historia Mearum Calamitarum, and we have a tradition, medieval tradition, precisely about this, about the tradition on the evil, and just not on the happiness. So it's a question for you if we could consider, this other line of tradition as a possibility, and not Aristotelian, but of course that could be considered in this, and also Kant, for instance, could be considered precisely throughout this interrogation on the evil, on the mal. Then finally, last thing.
Oh boy.
No, because it's I was really interested about it, and a bit also emotional, about this thing, about the scholasticism. If we take again this position that you are had, is question. Let's try to identify their life as a life. No, so there's a meditative. We can identify also the most abstract, the most as the logical scholasticism, but really as a form of meditative asceticism that can be compared of a convent, a cloister, when really a form of life can be recognized.
So okay, a lot of material to cover here. I'll try to tackle this from different angles. So concerning the question of aestheticism, the last thing you were saying, it is actually incredibly interesting that in the works, apparently in the works of this professional philosophers, you can actually find also dietary prescription. So it really seems that there was regimens of control of sensual pleasures and sensations and stuff like that, that really did seem as if they were engaged in what we call philosophy as a way of life. But to go back to Fioravanti, which I think it's real relevant, he has a very, I don't know if I managed to explain that as precisely as I wanted to, but he has a very complex position concerning this issue. So on the one side, Fioravanti tells us that the interpretative model inaugurated by Maria Corti's La Felicità Mentale can actually constitute a critique of Hadot's conception of a medieval decline of philosophy as a way of life, because Fioravanti is convinced, he tells us that this professors by philosophy did present themselves certainly as the heirs of that ancient tradition. That was part of what they were doing. And if we see if we take a look at Boetius's De Summa Bona, for instance, its subtitle of that work is the life of the philosopher. It couldn't be more clear than that. And here comes the twist. For Fioravanti, that that's only an ideological projection that masks basically the demands for more prestige and power within the context of the university of this masters. Because at the time, apparently the existing accounts report that those philosophers, those first professional philosophers, weren't doing too good in terms of salary, in terms of the fact, of course, that their entire discipline was subordinated to theology. So Fioravanti takes this kind of strange position because he tells us once again, they did presented themselves as the heirs of that tradition. And on the other hand, we shouldn't really trust too much in their declarations, in their the ideal of life that they purport to represent. And that, according to him, particularly in the case of those, that's a particularly relevant point to make, especially for those professors of philosophy who claim to be aiming at a union with God. It would, for him, is just not credible enough. It is as if, I would be claiming, as if I was to claim that my aim with this presentation or writing this paper was to, just reach a state of mystical union with God. I mean, that was not just credible enough. Maybe, I hope so. I'm waiting.
Okay, pass over to John there.
And Dante, I'm sorry, just a brief remark. Dante's case is absolutely fascinating. I'm preparing my postdoctoral research proposal on Dante's reception of this paradigm of intellectual philosophy. Because Dante, on the one side, does in the Convivio receive and assimilates many. Assimilates this concept of intellectual philosophy, but on the other side, he says that the Averroists were just sold out. They were just people who sold their wisdom for money. Something, he didn't like much.
Yeah, thanks. A quick comment on what you were just saying then, right? So the guys who are the arts masters, these Latin Averroists who stay in the arts faculty, they're the ones who aren't the careerists, right? They're the ones who choose not to go on and do the PhD in theology and have the big career. They're the guys who effectively decide to stay as graduate teaching assistants forever rather than sell out, right? So maybe that's something in their favor as, as a way of life.
Absolutely. Alain Libera makes exactly that point.
But that wasn't my question. But no, absolutely fascinating paper. Please send me a copy. Really, really interesting. My sort of thoughts is sort of directed towards some of the people that you were quoting at the beginning, where this discussion seemed to be very much focused on Aristotle, on his status, and on the reception of Aristotle. And so just thinking more broadly about philosophy as a way of life in the Middle Ages, of course, you've got Seneca and you've got Cicero, and in people like Peter Abelard and John of Salisbury, you've got these expressions of what looks like philosophy being a guide to a good life, but drawn from those Latin sources without any reference to Aristotle. And much later in Roger Bacon, and he writes his Opus Meus, he gets a section on ethics, and he just plagiarizes Seneca, right? Not plagiarism in the strict sense, because he says, basically says, Seneca has said this better than anyone else, so I'm just going to copy out
4 pages of Seneca. So there's nothing else to say on ethics, right? So, and of course, it's that very practically oriented material that we know from Seneca. And then perhaps the most popular ancient philosophical text throughout the Middle Ages, the only one ever translated into a vernacular, is of course the other Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, right?
Right.
So, so I think the stuff on Latin Averroism is really interesting as a kind of one example of philosophy as a way of life in the Middle Ages, but there's also all these other interesting things going on as well. So it's really quite rich, I think.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And actually concerning, now I'm just connecting dots concerning, absolutely fascinating, this also idea of the professionalization of philosophy that Alain de Libera puts forward, especially when we consider someone like Dante. For instance, Dante in the Convivio tells us that he was converted to philosophy. He turned to philosophy after the death of Beatrice, precisely by leading the consolation of Boethius, for instance, among the many other examples. But yes, though many of those lines of research, which are very promising, I think, were open with Domansky. Domansky treats Abelard and Roger Bacon, and all of those are really worth pursuing. Absolutely, I think. The Middle Ages are very rich period to investigate what's from the perspective of philosophy and the way of life. Absolutely.
Just 2 more questions, then Electra, and then Hélder.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting. And my question is about the controversial and important role of Aristotle in medieval perception, and also in the role of Aristotle in relation to the philosophy's as way of life. It is my impression is that the problem in Aristotle is the fact that is not the fact that he made a distinction between theory and action. Okay? But the fact that Aristotle made a distinction between action, praxis, and technique. And the problem is that the philosophy as way of life is so it is not
Useful.
Useful, exactly. Thank you. Useful. It is something that have not an end, or that has an end in itself. In this sense, is contrary to the document. And then, so this is particularly problematic also in relation to the role of philosophy as professional activity, and this is related to the first presentation. But in any case, my curiosity was there is how the medieval reception, or if and how, in this case, the medieval reception of Aristotle interpreted these distinction, because this is the point. Because why happiness cannot be useful, cannot be useful, or cannot be something that has really an end, or that had to do with an action that not only has an end in itself.
Yeah, I see your point. I mean, the reception of Aristotle in the Middle Ages is something incredibly complex. I mean, part of Alain de Libera's works do exactly that. He's trying to sketch out exactly the sources through which that paradigm of intellectual philosophy that can be retraced all the way back to Aristotle reemerged in the Middle Ages, in the Christian Middle Ages. And funnily enough, it did so mostly through Arabic sources. Particular, Alain de Libera ascribes a lot of importance to the fact that that paradigm was filtered through the Arabics for a variety of reasons. But to go to your, to address your question, I mean, as far as I understand this text of the Latin Averroists, for them, I mean, theory, the life theory is an end in itself, and but it is an end in itself, and that's exactly what makes it, what allows you to experience happiness, because you are devoting yourself to something that has no end beyond itself. How?
As action in Aristotle.
Yeah. But how, let's say, how that relationship between technique and practice and technique might have been reshaped through this huge complex process of the medieval perception and the rediscovered the corpus Aristotelicum. I mean, I must plead ignorance, I might say. I mean, it's such a complex question. But thank you for it. Thank you for the comment.
Before we go on to the final question by Hélder, I see there's a little comment, I think, by Sundar. I think he deserves to be heard because he's the person that warned us that Sundar, you're still with us. So congratulations. There's a comment that just says the final doubt is not only directed against the medieval professors, it also raises the question if today's university philosophers are worthy of talking about PWL. My goodness. So food for thought. And last question from Hélder.
Thank you very much, Matteo. That was very fascinating, and I learned a lot, very instructive. I'm not familiar with it at all, so it was very eye-opening. And I was wondering if you find in these authors any distinction between sapientia and philosophia, and if they conceive of philosophical activity as something that also implies a process of learning, or is more kind of activity that one can immediately enact if one decides to. So is there any role for this component of spirituality, of practices, of asceticism that one must go through in order to be able to come to intellectual felicity, to some kind of union with God? Does this play a role, or is it more in the background as it often is in Aristotle?
No, actually, that's surprisingly enough, that's one of the main themes that gets discussed almost at the beginning of every dissertation on the topic. So all these scholars, but also eventually Dante, who inherits this way of doing philosophy, basically, or this paradigm of intellectual philosophy, what they do is basically to say, you know, they're trying to pinpoint what's the supreme good, right? What's worth doing in life. But after they do so, they list a series of, they call impediments to our ability to reach that ideal. And most of the time they do so by identifying the passions, but also like physical impediments. I mean, there is a whole literature, let's say, there are whole entire passages on the theme. But as I was saying before, what's also surprising is that apparently these authors also prescribe dietary regimes, for instance, which seems, you know, which one would associate with what we understand for philosophy, the way of life in antiquity. Also, there is a whole debate about it, but also sexual abstinence, for instance. So Sigurd Brabant, for instance, if I'm not mistaken, was famous for prescribing like sexual abstinence. So it seems like a real ascetic practice, which would somehow undermine also Fioravanti's skepticism concerning his philosophy. It's a whole question to be investigated, in fact. Thank you.
Very quick note that just Matteo and Max and Andrew Irvine will have a translation of Demosthenes' book into English, the one that was given at College de France, which explores more of these themes. Shameless plug, also one on his book on Erasmus, who also has an interesting role in this conversation. So if people are interested, shameless plug for the real series. And for these two, did some great work on that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Matteo.